All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching this. This will be reading brief 5 of the Gateway Experience, Brain Hemisphere Synchronization and Perspective. And we left off at dimensions in between. We discussed a little bit how they interpret the idea or notion of a dimension and how it relates to existing theories. And then I sort of tried to add a few graphics of my own to help communicate this graphic here. We're going to go a little deeper into some more complex stuff. Some of it may be considered New Age. Some of it's obviously not New Age, and that's sort of a oxymoronic term in that this knowledge has existed for a very long time. It has just been communicated differently and in different contexts, using different symbols, tropes, ideas, metaphors, even drawings in some cases. All right, so dimensions in between. Now that we have postulated the legitimacy of the assertion that the energy forms which compose consciousness can move beyond the time-space dimension, we need to turn our attention to the energy forms which inhibit those dimensions between time-space and the absolute. In doing so, we may better perceive the form that reality assumes when we encounter it in those intermediate dimensions. In this context, Bentoff tells us, quote, "The casual relationship between events breaks down. Movements become jerky rather than smooth. Time and space may become grainy or chunky. Perhaps a piece of space can be traversed by a particle of matter in any direction without necessarily being synchronized with a piece of time. In short, a pair of events will occur in either time or space, the pair not being connected casually, but by a random fluctuation." So I think the drawing that I did this way, saying, you may be here and you may want to go here. Again, I don't necessarily have the right vocabulary, obviously, to communicate this as intelligently as I would like. But that's what we're sort of, I think, if I had to draw a graphic of that, that's what we're talking about here. I wouldn't say I know exactly what time and space may become grainy or chunky. We're using materialistic words here to describe otherwise conscious dependent ideas or experiences that we may not even have a word for yet. And since there haven't been enough people who have experienced it that are communicating openly in public, we don't have their input or feedback regarding any visual icons or pictographs or anything like that necessarily, other than what I just mentioned may be included in ancient esoteric or religious texts. What Bentoff means is that inside the dimension of time-space, where both concepts apply in a generally uniform way, there is a proportional relationship between them. A certain space can be covered by energy moving in either particle or waveform in a certain time, assuming a specific velocity virtually anywhere in the time-space universe. This relationship is neat and predictable. However, in the intermediate, apologies for the stumbling, guys. Intermediate dimensions beyond time-space, the limitations imposed on energy to put it into a state of oscillating motion are not uniform as they are in our physical universe. A myriad of various distortions and incongruities are thus likely to be encountered, such that our nice, neat assumptions concerning the relationship between time and space as we know it in this dimension do not apply. But even more important, access is opened to both the past and the future when the dimension of current time-space is left behind. So again, I think this idea where I said let's just use their incongruities, and how I said that throughout this loop, this sort of coil is where the energy is generated that we're supposed to be traveling upon as it stays center. Or perhaps in the case of this graphic, the energy we're traveling on has sort of something like this, where the ability to jump out or pop out is wholly dependent on the incongruity or the spike within the energy that's generated as consciousness moves forward or backwards. A certain space can be covered by energy moving in either particle or waveform in a certain time, measuring a specific velocity virtually anywhere in the time space. Excuse me. That, again, for me, it paints a literal picture. Where am I supposed to presume I'm the particle, or my consciousness is the particle? And in that experience, is the wave something I'm actually capable of perceiving with whatever, let's say, my light body is? Or am I just experiencing it and it's more of a vibrational thing? Or is it all of that? But this kind of language, again, not to the discredit of the commander of the people who wrote this and helped create these programs, it's just, they're as limited as they are as well. And not that these aren't written intelligently, it's just, if we have to explain this stuff, obviously you have to try it or do it too. And, empirical knowledge is gleaned from that experience as well. However, sometimes, again, I think we just need to draw stuff out first and look at that plausibility through just pictures that aren't confined by some of the perceived absolute meanings behind words, because everyone has seen pictures of particles or artwork, basically, of particles, and that immediately creates a perception. And in this day and age, in 2019, in December, we have much pop culture, media, and content that paints pictures of us for what time and space look like and what it should be perceived as. And of course, the military could have been involved in certain projects that are related to contemporary media and pop culture, in that they want to loosely familiarize people with these notions. And that's possible too. But again, I don't necessarily have any access to that information to verify what's being shown is attributed back to this research or not. So 22. Special status, out-of-body experience. Although human consciousness can, with enough practice, move beyond the dimension of time-space and interface with other energy systems in other dimensions, the entire process is appreciably enhanced if the consciousness can be detached in large measure from the physical body before such interface is attempted. So there's a brief reference to what I asked about the body and the materialistic claim of, light travel or me expanding my wideness capabilities versus my physical body going anywhere. Once an individual becomes proficient in the technique of out-of-body movement and then reaches the point where he is able to break out of time-space while out of his body, he gains the advantage of clicking out part of his enhanced consciousness while starting from a base located much closer to the dimensions with which he wishes to communicate. In other words, since he is starting from a point much higher up, to use an analogy from the time-space context, that part of his consciousness involved in clicking out will have that much more time to interact in dimensions beyond time-space, because less time is required to traverse the intervening layers. Moreover, once the individual is able to project his consciousness beyond time-space, that consciousness would logically tend to entrain its frequency output with the new energy environment to which it is exposed, therein greatly enhancing the extent to which the individual's altered consciousness may be further modified to achieve a much heightened point of focus in a much refined oscillating pattern. As a result, a self-reinforcing process should ensue whereby the farther consciousness in the out-of-body state can be projected beyond the time-space dimension, the more its level of energy output would be enhanced, thus promoting the potential for still further travel. The tentative conclusion to be drawn is that the out-of-body state may be regarded as an extremely effective way of accelerating the process of enhancing consciousness and of interfacing with dimensions beyond time-space. If the practitioner of the gateway technique has a choice of concentrating on achieving and exploiting the out-of-body experience as opposed to concentrating his full efforts on expanding his consciousness exclusively from a physical base, the former would appear to promise much faster and more impressive success than does the latter. So let's read that again. As a result, a self-reinforcing process should ensue, whereby the farther consciousness in the out-of-body state can be projected. That may mean my version of wideness beyond the time-space dimension, the more its level of energy output would be enhanced, this promoting the potential for still further travel. I don't see how the energy output would be enhanced unless the implication is that our material body is a confine, which is sort of in a way esoterically the idea of your body containing your soul. The more its level of energy output would be enhanced, thus promoting the potential for still further travel. It's a tough one. The tentative conclusion to be drawn is that the out-of-body state may be required or regarded as an extremely effective way of accelerating the process of enhancing consciousness and of interfacing with dimensions beyond time-space. If the practitioner of the gateway technique has a choice of concentrating on achieving and exploiting the out-of-body experience as opposed to concentrating his full efforts on expanding his consciousness exclusively from a physical base, the former would appear to promise much faster, more impressive successes than does the latter. Okay, so they're not sure if he has a choice. So it's like, if I'm out of consciousness, am I still conscious of what's happening around me? I guess would be the idea, which is what I think I alluded to too with the radio antenna being out there, or the notion of astral projection, whereby you I'm going to shift to my chair, whereby you graft yourself to either someone on that timeline or even an animal. Absolute in perspective. It may be helpful at this point to pause and recap the major aspects of our intellectual journey from time-space to the realm of the absolute. We have spoken at some length concerning the incredibly complex hologram which is created by the intersection of energy patterns generated by the totality of all dimensions of the universe, time-space included. We have noted that our minds constitute energy fields which interact with various aspects of this hologram to deduce information which is ultimately processed through the left hemisphere of our brains to reduce it to a form that we employ for the process we call thinking. We have implied that this hologram is the finite embodiment in active energy form of the infinite consciousness of the Absolute. It is the title we assign to that vast pool of energy in a state of perfect rest over which the physical universe is layered and from whence it comes. Incidentally, to describe this, Bentoff uses the analogy of a very deep sea, comparing the still depths of the sea to the dimension of the Absolute, while assigning the storm-tossed waves above to represent the physical universe with which we are familiar. The slightly agitated currents of the sea to be found in between the turbulent surface and the totally still depths represent energy in the process of either going into rest or coming out of rest. Everything was good until those last two sentences there. I get the analogy of the deep sea. It's similar to what I tried to use as the body of water, I think in chapter 4, in reading brief 4. There's some drawings that's going to come up. Some of you may be familiar with them if you're even if you're a returning listener, reader. And they're pretty popular on the internet. You can find very similar graphics. I'm not the first to read these, and I probably won't be the last. So, from Big Bang to Torus, number 24. Working from the widely accepted Big Bang theory, Bentoff presents a conceptual model to depict the process of time-space evolution, the relative position of the universal hologram. That hologram is often called a torus because it is thought to have the overall shape of an immense self-contained spiral. Well, there we go, a little vindication. Basing his thesis on recent studies concerning the distribution of quasars, quasi-stellar objects, and operating on the premise that in the universe smaller processes tend to mirror images of larger ones, i.e., the pattern of electrons around the nucleus of an atom mirrors the way planets orbit their suns, and so on. Bentoff postulates the following scenario. Taking his cue from the observed capability of quasars to eject enormously concentrated beams of matter from their interiors in a controlled, non-concentric version of the Big Bang, he envisages a similar process occurring in the generation of the universe. Noting that those galaxies located to the north of our own galaxy are moving away faster than those located to the south, and that those to the east and west are demonstrably more distant. Bentoff regards this as substantive evidence that the jet of matter which expanded into our universe has turned back upon itself, eventually forming an ovoid or egg shape. He sees matter in our universe entering the ovoid pattern following ejection from a nucleus composed of extremely compressed energy through a white hole. At the end of its trip to the far end of the ovoid, he sees it departing via a black hole. In such a model, time is observed to be a measure of the change which occurs as energy evolves into new, more complex forms as it progresses along the distance from the white hole side of the nucleus around the shell of this cosmic egg until it enters the black hole. In other words, as energy expelled from infinity and confined within limits by the consciousness of the Absolute achieves form and motion following ejection from the white hole at the top of the egg, time begins as a measure of the cadence of this evolutionary movement as reality goes around the shell of the egg on its journey to the black hole at the far end. The reference to the cosmic egg is also ancient. The reference to the torus is ancient. That's also known as the heart of the universe, the heart of an idea, the heart of yourself. There's, I guess, the spiral. When we say the spiral, and let's just draw something out here. So, and these are the various aspects. Well, we're real small in here somewhere, like, here. And we're still all traveling upwards. Even though matter expands this way, I guess, because they're using nautical, or, north, south, east, and west. The idea doesn't make sense because those four terms denote there's both motion upward as well as expansion outward, right? I mean, am I missing that? And that would create confusion in what we call the Big Bang. And that really, there's the conflict between the term infinity and the Big Bang, or the universe closing back on itself. I think from an esoteric aspect in more ancient texts, I noticed we use the term white hole here, and what some of us have already kind of postulated on is meant to be the sun. And then the black hole is the backside of that, where time, the sun and the moon is basically the result of this. Let me show you the picture. The moon is the result of time bending back on itself. And we're actually looking at the backside of the sun or something like that. And that's actually time, or that proves this sort of looks like it, but what's known as the Mobius strip, which of course looks like infinity. And I should probably make that bigger. Hold on one second. So the idea is that a rubber band twisted on itself. At this point, at these junctures, it's easier to make predictions about the world and your day or the universe and things like that. However, the way this is done, there are constantly new Mobius strips occurring. And somehow, I'm not sure what defines this shape here, or how they got to the cosmic egg diagram, but this does reference, there we go, the energy, the main point, or the flux that I was doing with my spiral here. Except for what they're doing is that it's, let's see if we can, it's interesting because that symbol, this is basically what they're showing us. Right? And actually, let's see, it's more like this. So this would be like another view of that. And then this would also incorporate or encompass the reason why we see the stars the way we do, the seasons and things like that. I don't have any additional comments on that because I'm still processing it. So if anybody out there does, feel free to add some links or something to the comments. So let's go into our place in time, and we'll stop. I'm going to leave that paragraph there. I hope I haven't caused any dissonance or confused anybody with my pauses throughout that, but sometimes I like to work things out with a pencil first. Our place in time. The observed distribution of galaxies suggests that our particular universe is located near the top of the egg. Okay. At the point where matter begins to fall back on itself, thus explaining the reason why the galaxies to the north are seen to be moving away more rapidly as they are caught up in the downturn of the stream of matter towards the far end of the cosmic egg. Layered over this cosmic egg is the absolute which sustains the radiating nucleus from which the original jet of matter issued forth. As the stream of matter moves around the ovid towards its destination at the black hole, where it will be reabsorbed into the radiating nucleus and then the absolute, it generates the interference pattern within the cosmic egg, which constitutes the universal hologram or torus. Since the torus is being simultaneously generated by matter in all the various phases of time, it reflects the development of the universe in the past, present, and future, parentheses, as it would be seen from our particular perspective in one phase of time. By reflecting on this model, it becomes possible to see how human consciousness brought to a sufficiently altered state could obtain information concerning the past, present, and future, since they all exist in the universal hologram simultaneously. In the case of the future, because all of the consequences of the past and present can be seen coming together in the hologram, such that the future can be predicted or seen with total accuracy. Moreover, it is possible to see how the implosion of energy patterns would cross and recross to create an incredibly complex four-dimensional hologram or torus. in spiral shape in reflection of the multidimensional developing pattern of evolution. All of the movements of the energies which comprise the universe leave their mark and hence tell their story throughout time. I'm going to read that last one again, the second to last. Moreover, it is possible to see how the implosion of energy patterns would cross and recross to create... Okay, so that's how they're saying... Well, he says energy, and remember when in chapter 4 I said let's use the term light, because as a bandwidth or a frequency, we can respond to light. So I'm going to make 2 points on that comment, one related to this and one related to our perception with our eyes. So don't be misled by these bands. What these bands are is it's almost like saying it's like the city of New York doesn't exist in this fold because as time moved upward, there was no one left to see it anymore who cared about it, so it didn't exist. Right? And that's kind of an esoteric statement as well, where there used to be teachings in some, not gospels, but teachings that would say your God will cease to exist if you stop believing in them, if you stop praying to them. And then in another way, we have another sort of sentiment is, seeing is believing, or manifest destiny, or in a more psychological way, we have self-actualization. Or in sports, you say you have to see the run, you have to see the move before you make it. And if that's the case, let's take this quote from Bertrand Russell: the more you look, the more you'll find. And I know that seems very simplistic, but coming from someone like him, I think what that means is just the universe will continue to expand as long as we keep observing. Right? At some point, what's also being said is, if the Christians are here, the Jews are here, the Buddhists are here, and new babies are there, whoever's projecting and believing the most manifests that reality somehow. And I don't mean magic, but I mean with what we're being told in some cases is literally an ability to create an object on site with nothing but your mind. Or in the case of movies, like pop culture references, is bend the spoon because the spoon isn't there. That's really hard to grasp because the spoon is there. It is there. It's going in my mouth. A welding machine or a molding machine took material matter and synthesized it into something that we can not only hold it and use it, but given where we are on the timeline, it will travel in the timeline as a relic and still be there. And in some cases, if it wasn't made by a machine and was made by hand instead, it will contain the energies of the makers. So those 2 points there, it's, I'm talking this out too rhetorically because I'm trying to grasp it, and I do understand a lot of the stuff fundamentally, but it's still materialistic. I feel like even saying that there's an end to space or a beginning already messes up the opportunity for the individual to experience this in a holistic way. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure if I'm wording that properly, but the idea here, in some cases, or the hologram, is that our consciousnesses, all of our little light bulbs are on, generating light and heat, and as they cross over and keep passing each other, those bands, those waves of heat and light are what generate our reality. Like basically the way a hologram works is crossing colored lasers across one another, and then there's enough material or matter in the ether, and it manifests a light projection that we can see. However, none of that's possible, though, right? If we just continue with the hologram itself as far as our technical capabilities are now, without something to project the hologram on or within. So then you just using that for now, we just apply that to the fact that that means we have to have a lens or some sort of self-contained module, right? Religious people might call it the firmament. Even the Egyptians have reference to an idea of a firmament. And then that may lead us back to why we say we're just a particle within a particle within a particle. And I get that, but man, does it just seem so unrealistic. And like I said, the idea for me is not to consider how small I am. It's to consider how wide I am, how wide I can be, how open I can be, not how small everything is in relationship to me. In fact, the idea alone of small shouldn't even be a thought, because that's almost like a materialistic anchor psychologically as well. It is kind of interesting that we have the reference to the Taurus there, and that's it's a pretty popular word. I don't want to crisscross with my English arts stuff that I've been talking about in some videos, but the word Taurus has some interesting origins as well. So let's go on to quality of consciousness. We noted earlier that the out-of-body state involves projection of a major portion of the energy pattern that represents human consciousness, so that it may move either freely throughout the terrestrial sphere for purposes of information acquisition, or into other dimensions outside of time-space, perhaps to interact with other forms of consciousness within the universe. Consciousness is the organizing and sustaining principle that provides the impetus and guidance to bring and keep energy in motion within a given set of parameters, so that a specific reality will result. Okay, well, there we go. We're creating our own universe with our brain power. Is like that's really what it comes down to. But then, what does it mean when we're making something with our hands that can stand the test of time, that can stay buried in the dirt and survive, or buried under the ocean and survive? That really also makes salt water or the ocean an entirely different phenomenon for us when we look at what it would mean. And I think the idea of the muck and the grime and the gook at the bottom of it, it's like, really technically speaking then, is that the layers just keep piling on. The land keeps growing in relationship to the amount of people that are on it. Or let's go into some other interesting so-called conspiracies of flat Earth and all that stuff. And what's really happening is the planet is more like this, right? It's more of a mushroom, and this always remains frozen out here. This part, the outer rim, remains frozen, and the more people are born, the more heat or energy we generate and consume, thereby expanding, melting the ice, and then revealing the water has somewhere to flow more. Let's just say that the bottom of the ocean is cosmic dust. It's literally cosmic dust. And we can, in fact, or do in fact, have more land. It's possible, if people would venture out further, in which case then, biologically speaking, and in relationship to the way the sun and the moon work over the atmosphere, or work in the atmosphere, this would then expand, right? The sun may get further away in an effort, or our days may get longer, or our nights might get longer, because now that the sun has to follow the migration patterns of us, or we follow it. I'm not, again, this is very loosely being described, and I'm using things that aren't really necessarily proven to myself yet, that like everything would take care of itself through natural means, through terrestrial magnetism, through the way energy should be, or light, if I change it over again to light. Light is perpetual. Even darkness is a form of light. It's just not a spectrum that we can register with our eyeballs, right? So just rewind that and let it sort through. And actually, there's another page coming up that looks pretty, that I should go back to after we erase this. So let's go back and look at these drawings here. Direction of time-space evolving. Okay, so that's, I mean, it's pretty similar to what I said, except for I guess we're this little dot in the middle here. Point where flow of time-space turns towards opposite pole of Ovid. I mean, it looks like a brain, right? That's like the pineal gland. Universal here. Again, we have this two-dimensional drawing, and it's just my brain trying to struggle with how to extrapolate this into a three-dimensional model. So let's do a drawing. Let's see. Because this is still what it would be. Where this outer circle, the big circle, my red one is a, just say that's the limit of where the light from the sun goes. Not that there's nothing out here, it's just the radiant effect of the light from the sun stops here. So this appears to be space. I mean, it appears to be darkness, but it's just a bandwidth. It is an absence of light as it relates to our ability to perceive that spectrum of light. All right, so yeah, I don't get this whole, I mean, with this explanation and this drawing, the whole idea of the planet of Earth being a ball is pretty weak. And there's also, in my own personal belief, I've tried to expound on some ideas where the sun, as much as we are dependent on it is dependent on us. And a recent video that I shared, that I captured some geoengineering and weather modification stuff and solar shields or climate whatever, the sun appeared to be a local event. So it's I've gone on a few tangents there to give people something to think about, but let's I don't want to deviate from the strength of this document right now. When consciousness reaches a state of sophistication in which it can perceive itself, its own hologram, it reaches the point of self-cognition. Human beings have this form of elevated consciousness, as does the Absolute, but in case of the latter, it is a function of energy and its associated quality of consciousness in infinity, omniscience, and omnipotence in perceptual unity. Omniscience. When energy returns to a state of total rest within the Absolute, it returns to the continuum of consciousness in the pool of limitless, timeless perception that resides there. Thus, the more complex an energy system in the material state, the more consciousness it possesses to maintain its reality. Well, the more people we have, the more stable our planet is. Unless those people are not conscious, in which case they're manifesting chaos and then the weather is a direct reflection of our consciousness, or the seasons, because that's what we're talking about here. They may not say weather, but the implication is that if it is mind over matter, then think about what a black art or dark art it would be if the entire process of staged news was for people to manifest those things, to the weaker minds among us, and we're all susceptible in one way or another to some ideas or tropes, is to manifest that reality, even if it's not real. And just consider that. It's like, for me, let's use Satanists, for example, and I don't really look at Satanists as a demonic thing or they really are just people with their own belief systems. And I think the strength of their power is in how the corporeal of it, their theater and ritual of it, is their power against other people, and that creates the perception, and it's like a form of energy harvesting. I'm going to shift my chair here. It is an occult form of energy harvesting of attention, and that would then psychologically make it real to other people, and then with enough time, the psychology of it turns into reality, because now it has become a mundane event for those people, which is a day-to-day living process, right? It turns into a day-to-day living process. But I've never ascribed any actual power to them other than to, like any other power, whereas no differently than, you see maybe Jesus walking on water. The idea that I'm presenting is that it's just the shock value of whatever it is that you're doing that either wakes you up and makes you recognize an alternative ability or experience, or it forces you inward and to accept what you're seeing as real. So it's an occult practice either way. It doesn't matter which side you're using or which side you're participating in, because the end result still produces the same, it still has the same intent. It still has the same intent. So when energy returns to a state of local rest within the absolute, it returns to the continuum of consciousness in the pool of limitless, timeless perception that resides there. Thus, the more complex an energy system in the material state, the more consciousness it possesses to maintain its reality. Our consciousness, therefore, is the differentiated aspect of the universal consciousness which resides within the absolute. It accounts for the organization of the energy patterns which constitute our physical body, but is distinctly separate from and superior to it. Since consciousness exists quite apart from and outside of reality, beyond the bounds of time-space, it, like the absolute, has neither beginning nor end. Reality has both a beginning and an end because it is bound within time-space, but the fundamental quantum of energy and its associated consciousness is eternal. When reality ends, its constituent energy simply returns to infinity in the absolute. Well, to break that down simplistically, it's like, does the forest exist if I'm not there to observe it? And that's basically saying nature. There's a natural phenomenon, or God. Whether or not I'm here, that energy will continue. However, while I'm here, I do have the power to manifest additional aspects of that reality, and thereby making an impact on the greater scope of nature or God or the energy. And that makes a little bit of sense, but the human being, this sentence here, human beings have this form of elevated consciousness, as does the absolute, but in the case of the latter, in the case of the latter, it is a function of energy and its associated quality of consciousness in infinity. So they're like saying, well, again, it's omniscience and omnipotence is what some people might call God. When energy returns to a state of total rest within the absolute, it returns to the continuum of consciousness in the pool of limitless, timeless perception that it resides there. That's, I think the problem with that for me is that it's such an accelerated learning or reverse learning process, because, like I've used the words instinct and intellect, or instinct over intellect, or instinct and intellect, and obviously when we're younger we have, everyone recognizes the deeper connection we have to our biology and the world around us. And then as we get older, some people completely withdraw and become truncated in their labels and their processes, and they no longer recognize their connection to anything else or anyone else, because they have built up these barriers of understanding. To simplify, it's almost egotistical in that way, where the minute you confine your belief system to something absolute that isn't part of reality, you are immediately detached from it. And that's like the greatest ego there is. Like, if you don't accept the energy that's outside of you that made you to bring you here, if you don't recognize that, then it's like, okay, now you're in hell. You're in hell because it's what you created. It's like you think you're above the process. You're outside of it. However, we have a little bit of wording here that says, well, you're always a part of it and you're always contributing to it. However, you can also guide it and manifest it. But in the end, no matter what, it's all still going to return to the source or the absolute. So I think we might have some connections here in relationship to relation and to religion and philosophy and some esoteric knowledge, but I may be ruining it for the listener right now with my rhetoric over on top of it, as I try to myself personally understand what this is trying to communicate. And this is different than the remote viewing stuff. I see why they have to go through this training. And it does make perfect sense. And it also makes sense, like I've mentioned in previous documents, where they would definitely look for younger recruits. And oftentimes it was military children who were brought into these programs because their parents understood what was happening, or what needed to happen in order for the child to be able to utilize these things effectively. So it's a tough one. This is one of the better documents, I think. So consciousness in perspective, having ascertained that human consciousness is able to separate from physical reality and interact with other intelligences in other dimensions within the universe, and that it is both eternal and destined for the ultimate return to the absolute, we are faced with the question: so what happens then? Since memory is a function of consciousness, and therefore enjoys the same eternal character as the consciousness which accounts for its existence, it must be admitted that when consciousness returns to the absolute, it brings with it all the memories it has accumulated through experience in reality. All right, so that's borderline touching on what I brought up in the end of video 4. The return of the consciousness to the absolute does not imply an extinction of the separate entity which the consciousness organized and sustained in reality. Rather, it suggests a differentiated consciousness which merges with the participants in the universal consciousness and infinity of the absolute without losing the separate identity and accumulated self-knowledge which its memories confer upon. What it does lose is the capability for generation of independent thought holograms, since that can be done only by energy in motion. In other words, it retains the power to perceive, but loses the power of will or choice. Okay, so that's answering some of my questions there with the ego and identity and maintaining what I would consider the ego of control over the experience. In exchange, however, this consciousness participates in the all-knowing infinite continuum of consciousness, which is a characteristic of energy in the ever-present. Consequently, it is accurate to observe that when a person experiences the out-of-body state, he is, in fact, projecting the eternal spark of consciousness and memory, which constitutes the ultimate source of his identity, to let it play in and learn from dimensions, both inside and outside the time-space world in which his physical component currently enjoys a short period of reality. I'm going to read that again. Yes, I am. Consequently, it is accurate to observe that when a person experiences the out-of-body state, he is, in fact, projecting the eternal spark of consciousness, and memory, which constitutes the ultimate source of his identity, to let it play in and learn from dimensions, both inside and outside the time-space world in which his physical component currently enjoys a short period. So I'm using what I know to travel to what I don't know, which we just remove some of the language here, and we just say that's basically the cycle of life. If I'm going to be a carpenter, I start out as an apprentice who knows jack squat. You play that joke on me where I got to pick up the left-handed hammer, and then I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this hammer can be used in both hands. Boom, IQ point, right? I bump up now. So right there is the sort of initiate's sort of understanding of the process here. And then I think the more high-level master, or someone who's more familiar with, let's say, the alchemical process, is that the energy and motion we see here is also loosely referencing someone who is pounding the existing reality to shape it into a new reality. And I use pounding just to continue to work to that blacksmith idea, where I just went and dug a hole in a mountain, pulled out the components in the dirt, and fired it up and made glass out of it. Using, and so when we're actually even using fire, when we light that cigarette, when we light that campfire, when we ignite that car to turn on, that is the power of the gods. That's us already for hundreds of years harnessing the power of the gods. Or healing somebody with cortisone cream, which is, the number of white, colored white things that we use for the benefit of humanity, whether it be pills, pharmacology, illegal drugs, creams, lotions, soaps. A lot of that stuff, there's additives in it to make it smell different or appear different. But I may have referenced it in a previous video, and I'm sure I did, was the entire alchemical process, or one version of the alchemical process as it's interpreted by me, is to discover the base essence of something. Or in some cases they call it the philosopher's stone, or it could have been the philosopher's salt, and the salt was just a reference. But sugars, salts, all the stuff that's white is the even down to how we make a very, very or a very good form of cement. The best. So in some cases, we're told that those recipes of the ancients are lost that they used, and the way calcium is extracted for ceramic tiles from seashells and rocks being burned until they're white, or bones being burned until they're white, and then the ash from that being mixed in and refused and recombined, and essentially the alchemical process is affirming the same thing here, that you can do what you want with it for a little while, but then sooner than later you or it will return back. The ceramic will break, it will turn back into dust, fall back into the earth. The human body, while the soul has traveled on, it's the great blacksmith in the sky gave you the physical body, or Mother Nature, or God, or whatever you want to call you. They composed your body through fire, ice, and water, whatever, however you want to describe it, through a miracle. And eventually, though, that body will wither and die. And then, yes, we do have other texts that look for that holy knowledge of keeping your body eternal on the plane. And we do have some knowledge and recent research that allows us to do that. But the interesting thing I've experienced with that all said, and all of us said now, especially as it relates to God, consciousness, thought travel, alchemical texts, and Masonic texts, which I have all loosely, in a way, mentioned just now in the past 4 minutes of talking. It's remember that memory is lost. You take a bit of it with you, but it's consolidated and you can no longer add or subtract to it anymore. Now, if someone were to live for 1,000 years, as we've seen in ancient texts often reference, I personally believe there are probably many ways to live a very long time and keep the body energetic. I think the withholding of the sun from us, and withholding water, and I think there are a number of exercises we all participate in every day, or processes that are designed to, in some cases, whittle us down a little bit, unfortunately. But the actual ability is probably contained within esoteric texts and occult texts. And but with all that said, I guess at what point, let's go philosophical here with that, if that's the case, what's the point of living that long? Right? You're going to build a castle. Sooner or later, you're going to control the whole state, the country. What are you going to do? You're going to gamble. You're going to bet on horses, make yourself wealthy, be a good person, and then just keep spending money so it goes back into the system, because that's what you're going to have to do anyways, because you can't hold it all yourself. Is that what we see when we hear things of bloodlines and lineages? Is that actually what has occurred? And then continuing on with that thought, why else is that what we mean by ego and the never ascending aspect of it? Like, do you want to ascend if the idea then is that you are no longer yourself? And then they call that the ego. Like, well, you don't want to be yourself forever. You want to return to the source. And most people that are living today are going to tell you, no, I'm at least most people in America or any of these other countries that are above what we might call the third world status. Not to belittle those other countries, because they're not actually below any status. It's just, I'm just using socio-political language here. But there's helicopters and there's planes and jet skis and pretty amazing food. And yeah, you could say, well, sooner than later you're going to get bored of that stuff. And like, well, okay, well, then I become a maker. Then I have to look at something to introduce into society to make it more interesting for other people to keep going, to keep them motivated. And I think that aspect, if people are looking at it that way, is one, highly motivating and a goodwill towards humanity, and two, is probably the best way to live life in perpetuity to the rest of the people. It's like, well, you have to be a maker. You have to constantly keep moving. You constantly have to keep creating, and you have to supplement. You have to bring energy to other people to get the energy to grow more. And just to bring that down to less jargon, it's like, you're basically you're not going to the source. You're not returning to this source here with all your memories, because you're getting more reward. You're getting a better reward in real time, I guess, on this plane or in this existence from other people who value you there. and also respect your individuality. And I'm only competing against what this document is. I'm not trying to compete. I'm not even competing with the document. I'm just referencing the document and using that as my punching bag when I go into these thoughts, not anything that's happening now or what's going on regarding this specific statement that I'm making. It's just, can you see why people of status or people with big families or people who have a lot to live for in the first place may not care about this at all anyways? Right? If this is what you're telling me, and I'm not taking it negatively, I think it's great to be able to thought travel, and we haven't really touched on, this document hasn't touched on the military weaponization of this stuff. It's just been about the experience and doing it. But why would people want to be engaged in this? Why would I want to sit in my chair for 2 hours every day and focus on doing this stuff when I might want to go jet ski or go fishing or go see my grandkids or something like that? And I think we have to make those distinctions, and by using those distinctions, I think we can kind of remove the fear of it all, right? Because this paper did such a good explanation, a good job in explaining what it wants to say, that it has now given me an opportunity to refute or rebuke or add to and subtract to it on my own terms, right? I haven't been forced to do anything. I was just explained what the process was. Now, if I didn't know anything about that process or anything about it, I would, like I said, the forest wouldn't exist. I wouldn't know it's there. I don't care. I'd walk right by. So I think and that's like the hidden city theory, right? The paradise has always been in front of you. It's always been here. It's just because you're looking somewhere else, you're attached somewhere else, you believe in something else, you fear something else. That's sort of what they mean by the, it's your body is your temple, or in case of, like, say, the Nazarenes or the Essenes, they didn't use churches or physical structures. As far as they were concerned, the entire plane, the planet, was the temple. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up on the gateway method. All right. Have a good day.